Greetings, everyone. This is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today I'm going to be doing a comparison video between Devarim Kafhet Samachet and Devarim 2868. This is a revisited video. So I know there are some people who are probably reading this or listening to this video and thinking, like, really? This topic again? Because I think already by just the title, some people may have already guessed what this basic topic is about. And yes, it's a revisit. So this topic has been one of these topics that has kind of come up every once in a while in my videos. And interestingly enough, it started before I even got, even had any real knowledge of what a Hebrew Israelite really was. I had come across some of them in New York every once in a while, but I didn't quite have a full understanding of what was being defined as Hebrew Israelite and what were the ramifications of someone calling themselves that. So I did a video years ago that got started that had nothing to do with Hebrew Israelites, and until that point, I never even said anything about them. And I think the video was called Israeli National Identity and also Jewish Migrations into West Africa. And immediately I started getting like messages from various Hebrew Israelites, with their disagreement, disdain and what I had like mentioned and this and that. So one of the ways that some people look at this is they say, okay, well, there must be this internet, sparring or verbal spar going on. And one way of looking at it is to say that the Hebrew Israelites are on one side and the, Torah Moshe Jews are, building on the other side, and people are building the same thing in the same spot, trying to connect to each other. But I kind of look at it in a different way, and because I don't really think of it that way. I don't see it as being that at all. And the way that I look at it is simply saying if you take there's two different lands on divided by a river, and they're both beautiful lands. They both have their own spaces and pluses and advantages to them. And people who feel comfortable, who are part of one side are part of one side. People who are part of the other side are part of the other side. So the way that I look at it is that Torah Moshe Jews and Hebrew Israelites are not the same people. Because we're from two different lands, on two different sides of things, and there's no reason for there to be a problem. So essentially, what this means in conclusion is that basically, Torah Moshe Jews have their own, we Torah Moshe Jews have our own distinct titles, texts, concepts, languages, needs, actions, claims, nationalities, etc. And by like token, Hebrew Israelites have their own distinct titles, texts, concepts, languages, needs, actions, claims, nationalities, etc. Now, I would think that that would be the end of it. But for the years that I've been doing videos, I've been getting all kind of messages from people who've been writing all kind of things. And it's one of these things where if you really read through some of the text, it becomes interesting at some point. At some point, it's almost comical, but then sometimes it's like really confusing. And the reason why I say that is because, I've had a number of people comment on my videos who were Hebrew Israelites, and they all say kind of like differing things. Like, for example, like this person here who claims that the Dead Sea Scrolls are not in Yiddish, but I don't know what that means to begin with exactly. There are Hebrew Israelites who claim that in my videos I'm speaking Yiddish, which is interesting. And then, they'll basically go through and try to define, their own thing. Again, this goes back like almost like 9 years in terms of videos I did that had nothing to do with Hebrew Israelites, and didn't mention them, didn't have anything to do with them. And the basic answers, basic things that are challenges that get really interesting. Like for example, one guy says that I'm Ashkenazi, and he says that Kikonga is Hebrew, not Yiddish. Okay, but then I get another guy who claims he's a Moor and also an Israelite, where he, for example, says that we're talking about the same thing, but the previous guy said we're not talking about the same thing. So this guy says he reads from the same kind of text I read from in Paleo Hebrew, but I don't read in Paleo Hebrew. And my text, except for the Samaritan Torah, is not in Paleo Hebrew. But then the previous guy said something different than what this guy says. And then another person says, that their language is pronounced in a different way, and it's like in parts of West Africa. And he says the Jews in Israel aren't the real biblical people, period, blah, blah, blah. And he also says Jerusalem is in Northeast Africa, different than some of the other ones. So essentially, I have a simple solution to all of this. Essentially, I have like a really simple solution I think that will resolve all of this because I don't really see any conflict, but it seems as if there are people who see it that way. What the starting point will be is that I'm going to show that Devarim, Kaf Het, Samachet, amongst Torah Moshe Jews is a different text than what Hebrew Israelites use. And I'm going to be basing this upon what, in terms of the Torah Moshe text, what Torah Moshe Jews say about the text and what it means. And then I'm going to take the Deuteronomy 28:68 that Hebrew Israelites often either quote to me or claim, or the claims that they make about it, and basically go through and show what their text says and show how they're not the same thing based upon everybody's comments about the text and what it means. So this is going to get a little complicated, but again, that's the basic point of this topic. So I'm going to first start with, since I'm a Torah Moshe Jew, I'm going to first start with, Torah Moshe text. Now, the important part is to remember that even if a person uses a Torah Moshe text that was produced, let's say, 10 years ago, that all Torah Moshe texts are basically produced or reproduced from previous texts that are a lot older. So essentially, any text you see me pulling up is basically, according to Torah Moshe history, is based upon previous texts that were there. So, for example, if I show you a 1,000-year-old text, that text was, of course, copied from a text that previously was like maybe several hundred years older than it, or maybe 1,000 years older than it, depending on the situation. But essentially, all texts that could be are in the possession of Torah Moshe Jews always points back to a common ancestor text. What this means is that when it comes to Torah Moshe Jews and Israelis, the basic issue is an authoritative text, meaning that even if I don't have in my possession a text that's 3,000, 4,000 years old, the issue is that if I have a text that is authoritative, meaning that it's been passed down through a chain of transmission throughout Torah Moshe Jewish and Israeli communities throughout the generations, then I can basically, support that text and say, okay, this is the text that we go by. And that may not fit into the requirements of the Hebrew Israelites, which most likely it won't, and I'll show you why pretty soon. But essentially, that is what I look for. So when I use a text, it means that I'm only using a text that is authoritative amongst Torah Moshe Jews and Israelis, which may not be authoritative to Hebrew Israelites, which normally it wouldn't be, of course. So essentially, if you were to take any Torah Moshe Jew and, for example, place them in front of this Aharon Kodesh that has these Torah scrolls in it that are on Jewel, essentially every Torah Moshe Jew would agree that these texts are valid in terms of the fact that they are written on Joel, and also because of the content that's in them. And that's what makes them authoritative. Because Joel, Torah scroll of these types, are usually several hundred years old. So just looking at the two here, these are probably around like 500 to 600 years old, and there are some that are even older than that. So again, that's what we mean by authoritative, that it is passed through the generations. It came from a scribe that is known within the Torah Moshe Jewish community, and essentially, the scribe and the text itself is proven to be authoritative and acceptable in our Torah Shemeshe Jewish community. And of course, that won't be the same for our Hebrew Israelite community because, of course, Hebrew Israelites have a different standard. But that's the standard we're going by when it comes to Torah Moshe Jews. So again, what that means is that whether it be a Sefer Torah, whether it be a Chumash text, something that's written in a book form, amongst Torah Moshe Jews, we know what's authoritative, and these are the kind of things that you would see from people like us that are authoritative and are acceptable in our communities and are produced by our communities. Meaning that if I were to pull this text out, I can show you how the people who transcribed them or passed them on were Torah Moshe Jews and defined themselves as such and didn't define themselves in either way. So the people who produced these texts never defined themselves as Hebrew Israelites. So that's something we have to make clear. That these texts were not produced by people calling themselves Hebrew Israelites. They were produced by people who held by Torah Moshe and they were Jews. Okay, so starting this comparison, this comparative analyzation, or the comparative analysis between what a Torah Moshe Jew has in a text versus what a Hebrew Israelite has in their text. Let's start back where we started before. The Aleppo Codex is an authoritative text within the Jewish community, within the Torah Moshe Jewish community, meaning that if this text is not acceptable to someone else, that's perfectly fine. We don't push our text on other people. This is something where if I were to bring the Aleppo Codex in front of any Torah Moshe Jew, it's 100% acceptable as a text because we know where it came from. We know the chain of transmission that it came from. We also know the texts that were copied from it, if you will. So if I was to bring this text to any Torah Moshe Jew, it's completely acceptable. Nobody's going to say, oh, well, there's older text. Okay, that's perfectly fine that there's older text. This one is authoritative, and I'm going to show other authoritative texts also in comparison to this text. So again, just starting here, this is more than about 1,000 years old. And basically, the part we're looking at is what says the following: "V'hashivacho Adonai Mitzrayim ba'aniyot, b'derech asher omarati l'cho lo tasiv od l'roto, v'hitmarkatam shom lo yavecho l'avarecho la'avodim l'shivachot v'ein koneh." So if you remember, this is the part where basically it talks about how Hashem would cause the Am Yisrael at the time. Essentially, this is a nevuah that deals with one of the potentials that could happen if if Torah Moshe Jews don't, Israelis don't keep Torah Moshe. So essentially, the Torah Moshe text says that Hashem would cause people to be returned to Mitzrayim on the Anuyot boats in this situation. And it also goes on and further says, and you will sell yourselves. Now, this is the point of contention that basically would be brought up and shown and described. And you will sell yourselves. And then it says that what basically in koneh, and there won't be anyone who's buying. There won't be a buyer. So again, I'm kind of running through this somewhat without fully explaining it. For those who haven't seen any of these videos, don't understand where I'm coming from on this. There's a number of what's called nevuot in the Torah Moshe text, that speaks about what could happen if potentially the people of Israel don't keep the Torah. Now, again, the one thing that's important is that in Torah Moshe, a negative, if you will, nevuah, which is also in English called a prophecy, doesn't have to happen. In fact, it doesn't even have to happen completely in a certain way. It depends on the actions of the people. So if the people's actions are so far off, then a negative nevuah can happen exactly as it is. If the people's actions are kind of somewhat, it can happen in the way that is partially fulfilling of it. But then if the people's actions are to make shuvah, to turn away from the things that are causing them to break the Torah, the negative prophecy doesn't have to happen at all. So essentially, it's not like the Creator says, okay, this is what's definitely going to happen when it comes to be negative. If it's positive, it has to happen in the Torah. If it's negative, it doesn't have to happen. It depends on the actions of the people. So this is what the Aliba Codex says, and this is the information. If you were to translate it, this is how you would translate it. So let's look at another text. This is from the Leningrad Codex. Okay, this is also, even though it's called the Leningrad Codex, it didn't come from Russia. It's a text that was copied and transcribed in Egypt, and essential amongst Egyptian Torah Moshe Jews. And it's a little bit younger than the Aleppo Codex, but essentially both of them come from an authoritative source or authoritative sources. So the same thing here. Well, you see where it says, "Well, and he will cause you to be returned." And then also the word "mihitmar ketan," which means you will sell yourselves. And then lastly, it says "wa'en koneh," and there won't be any buyer. So again, it says the exact same thing that was in the Aleppo Codex. The Leningrad Codex agrees with it. So if we continue, if you go to some of the older like Tajim, these are like Yemenite Chumash texts from Torah Moshe Jews in Yemen, comparatively, you would see the same thing. When you see Wahishi V'cho, which same thing translates into He will cause you to be returned. Wahif Markatam, which means then you will sell yourselves. And then Wa'en Koneh. So essentially what this means is that if in this situation, that if Am Yisrael commit certain types of avirot, meaning certain types of transgressions of the Torah in a certain way, and if it's deemed that this particular negative nevuah is supposed to happen, some of the characteristics we see is that they would be returned back to Mitzrayim, the boats, and that also that they would try to sell themselves, we market them to sell themselves to their enemies, to be like servants, male and female, and that nobody will buy, or they won't be a buyer. So essentially, that is what this the Torah Moshe Jewish text says. And one of the things that's important is that okay, this is what I'm showing you. This is what the text says. So I've shown you three super texts that are authoritative and acceptable. And we'll go on further and see what that means exactly, or even to see if I'm just making this up myself. So in order to understand, okay, well maybe somebody could say, well, I have you're just making that up. You don't understand Hebrew. You don't know what you're talking about. And the person could say, okay, let's find all kind of ways to prove what I'm saying wrong, which is perfectly fine. Well, one of the ways to verify what I'm saying is to look at Torah Moshe commentators from the last about, I would say, about 2,000 years and see what they say about the text. So starting with Targum Onkelos or Tarjum Onkelos on Devorim, Perek Kaf Het, and the same text we're talking about, he mentions the following. This is an Aramaic translation of the Torah, meaning it's like an Aramaic commentary on the Torah. He says, ויותבנוך אדוני מצרים בסיפונון בערוכו, די אמרית לך לא תוסף עוד למחזיה, ותיז דברנון, המון לבעלי דברם, العبدين والعمهون والدقونة. So if you look at the highlighted areas, the highlighted yellow area, he says what these dabanun, which means that you will sell yourselves. So he agrees with the thing I mentioned that it's like to sell yourselves. It's not to be sold, it's to sell yourselves. And further, his translation is Tarjum in the green. It says "Waletha degonoe" means that no one will buy, or there will be no buyer. So essentially, the Targum from about 2,000 years ago agrees with what I mentioned in the previous video, but maybe that's not enough. So let's go further. Let's look at Rashi. Rashi is from several hundred years ago. I think probably around like maybe 500, 600 years ago, something like that. Rashi, in his commentary on this same pasuk from Devarim, Kaf Het, he says the following, and then this is starting in the light blue at the top. He says, commenting on that particular section about you will sell yourselves, he says, "Atem mebakshim liot nam kirim lahem la'avadim l'shilfachot." So he says that you request to be sold to them as like male slaves or female slaves. Going in the green, he says, "Wa'im konem." He says, "Ki yikzaru alecha harag v'chiliyot." So essentially, he says that when commenting on the part where it says, and there will be no buyer, because he says, because they will basically make a ruling or a sense that you should be killed instead, that you shouldn't be slaves. So, going further with Rashi's commentary, and he basically brings up another source concerning Hikmat Kartem. This is also brought up in the text, and it says, "V'tim koru atzmechem." So essentially, this additional information that is brought up in the Rashi commentary says that you will try to sell yourselves. So essentially, that means that when it says "V'hitmar katem," so we've seen two sources that say that it means you will try to sell yourselves. And then continue in the yellow, and it says, "V'lo yitechen leforesh hitmarkatem lashon v'nimkartem al yedei mochurim acharim mipnei shene'amar acharav ve'en koneh." So essentially, what the last comment made in this Rashi commentary is essentially that when it says that hitmarkatem, it's not to be understood as nimkartem, meaning nimkartem means like you will be sold. Well, Rashi says that's not correct. It shouldn't be understood that way. It should only be understood as you will try to sell yourselves. And the last reason he brings up is because he says that nobody will buy. So it's basically like saying, okay, well, Rashi agrees with what I translated. That basically it means that you will try to sell yourselves and that you won't be bought. According to the Torah Moshe Jewish text. So Rashi held by Torah Moshe, just like I do, and so did Onkelos. So now let's look at another commentary. This is Okay, so now if we kind of go over what we went through so far. So far we've given two sources, two commentators, one from about 2,000 years ago, living in the land of Israel, that was Targum Onkelos. Another one from Rashi, who was living in France, probably I think around like 600, 700 years ago. And then now we have the Ramban from several hundred years ago, living in Spain, he was a Sephardic Jew. So essentially what the Ramban on the same pasuk says, "V'hashivocho Hashem mitzrayim ba'aniyot," he says, "Shehoyo ze ka'asher kulo le'otzi'am min ha'aretz." So essentially what he says is that this particular part where it says that our calls you be returned to Mitzrayim, to the land of Egypt by boats, means that they'll be taken from the land of Israel to Egypt. So essentially the place that they're being taken from is directly to Egypt, during that time. So he says further to that, and that first part we read, it was in the yellow. So in the green, what he says is Rabbeinu Amuru, ולמה למצרים לפי שלשכחו ורע לעבוד כשהוא חוזר לרבו הראשון. So essentially, what he says here is that our rabbis like stated, why Egypt? Why going back to Egypt? And he says basically it's not really nice. It's like ugly and also bad for a person to like basically be serving all over again the master, the first master that they had, if you will. So essentially, what he's saying is that this particular like section of the Torah that says, at least the Torah Moshe version of it, is being very specific that the people of Israel who this judgment was coming upon would be taken back to a place not only that they had been before, but that to a master that they had already had before. So again, this is like him saying the exact same thing I mentioned before. So continuing on, what he mentions which is in the light blue, it says "אבל אחרי היותנו בגלות בארצות אויבינו לא נתקלדו מעשי ידינו ולא אלפינו ועשרותינו צאננו ולא כמה כרמנו ולא עסקתנו וזיתנו ואשר נזרע בשדה אבל אנחנו בארצות כאשר העמים יושבי הארץ ההיא, או בטוב מהם שירחמו עלינו. כי ישבתנו בגלות היא בהבטחות שאמר לנו, ויקרא כ"ו מ"ד, ואף גם זאת בהיותם בארץ אויביהם לא מאסתם ולא געלתם ולכלותם לעבר בריתי אותם כי אני השם אלוהים. וכבר פרשתי בסדרים בחוקותיי ט"ז סוד הברית הזאת וכי הוא על זמן גלותנו היום ביד החיות הרביעית ואחר כן הבטיח בקבלו הגאולה ממנו. So essentially, what he's saying is that one of the things that was going to happen in this particular exile, this one that's being mentioned in this text, is that it's not going to cause the Jewish people to completely be spoiled or, if you will, destroyed. So essentially, what this means is that it's this particular exile that's talking about by being brought to Mitzrayim is not going to cause the Jewish people to like basically lose the Torah completely. Essentially, it's going to be a situation where they will be preserved and that the practice of the Torah will be preserved. Because when it says lo nitkandalu, basically what that means is that they won't be spoiled, if you will. So our enemies will be there to be able to try to destroy us. So they'll be there to exile us, but they can't completely like destroy the Jewish nation. They won't cause a complete abandonment of the Torah. So going on to the next commentators, we'll cover these kind of more quickly. So Forono, in the same like place, when it comes to the place where it says, "And you will sell yourselves," which is in the yellow, he says, "V'tishtadlu la'asot minei malachot ulhitparenes bahem bekerev ha'imot." So he says that you'll attempt, you'll try to like do different types of work to like make money from them, and basically from like the kerev ha'imot from the nations. So essentially, what he's saying here is when it says you sell yourselves, that you'll try to do like lots of work to make money from the nations. So that's same kind of thing, basically a different situation. And then he says in the green, "Ve'en koneh," he says, "Ein ish mehem chofetz b'melachtacha kadei shelo tuchal להתפרנס בה." So he says that when he says "ein koneh," like no one will buy, he interprets this as saying that that the people of the nations won't that basically not just won't be buying, but that they won't want to even like have a desire for your work. They won't even want your work, so that you can even basically supply for yourself. So essentially, again, he's saying something from a little bit different angle, but it's basically the same thing I'm saying. What I mentioned in my translation. So the next person is Rabbi Ibn Ezra. So basically, what he says is concerning Wahit Markartem, and in the green at the top of his is the Enu Kamo Nim Kartem. So basically, what he says is this is not like you will be sold. Nim Kartem base is 100%. It means you will be sold. And he says it's not like that. He says Rak Pirushon, and in the yellow he says Atem Tivakshu Limkor Atzmechem Anashim Anashim In Kone Vahina. So essentially, what he says is he backs up what I was saying earlier in my previous video that you will like request to sell yourselves, men and women, and no one will buy. So essentially, he says the same thing. Then Baal Turim basically says, "Vahishivacho Hashem," concerning like you Hashem will cause you to be brought back to that place, meaning that Mitzrayim or Egypt. Now he interestingly says if you follow the gematria, he says gematria ze yiyeh b'yamei Yemiriel. So he says that the gematria of like being returned by ships to Egypt, and if you go by the gematria of it, essentially that's talking about the days of Yemiriel. So again, you have all these different commentators, who are saying these things that are basically similar to what I said, basically the exact same thing I said, because it's from them they follow Torah Moshe just like I do, and it's from them we learn, different things. So continuing, going to a Yemenite midrash called the Midrash Hagadol that was produced in Yemen. The author of this, who was also a Torah Moshe Jewish author, basically says, if you look at the bottom of the blue one, what he basically, it's like a blue and red kind of star on the right. When he talks about the word, the statement, that you'll sell yourself to your enemies as like servants and female and male servants, and no one will buy. He says the following: "Kamo shehaya b'yamei Hamon shehayu mehazarin b'chol Yisrael mikro afilo b'minar v'lo hayta b'riyah koneh oto." So basically, he's basically quoting that it'll be just like the time of, of Haman, mentioned in the book of Esther, that even if you were to try to sell yourself as a Jew, even for like, a dinar back then, then nobody would want to buy. And he continues to say, "Shall you omrim mana seelo lenikoloto ulmachar hu naro." So essentially, and then l'choch ne'amar le'en koneh. So essentially, what he's making is a parallel here. He's saying that if it's similar to what happened in the book of Esther, where Haman was just willing to destroy the Jewish people. He didn't care about trying to sell them into slavery. He just wanted to completely destroy the Jewish people, including men, women, and children. So he's making the connection with the, you'll try to sell yourselves, and no one will buy, to this situation where the only goal that Haman had was to basically get rid of the Jewish people, and that's the same thing here. There is no goal to buy and sell. There is no goal to enslave. That the goal basically is that, the people who were, this will happen to will be looking just to destroy the Jewish people. So essentially, what we've seen is that there's a common source text from Torah Moshe Jews and even the Samaritan text. If you go back to my original video on this, um, where I took this on, I also showed like what the Samaritan Torah says, and the Samaritan Torah has like a Paleo Hebrew type script that I know a lot of Hebrew Israelites like to use, and you'll see the same thing that I mentioned there, that they have the same kind of information in their text. So, what you see is a commonality between all Torah Moshe Jews on this particular point. So it isn't just like me making this up. This means that all Torah Moshe Jews would, agree with what I mentioned on this, which basically pushes the point that Hebrew Israelites have a different culture, text, understanding of their text, things like that. Basically what I've been saying the whole time. Now, someone may ask, but what about the Dead Sea Scrolls? Well, what's interesting is that if I understand correctly, their Hebrew Israelites don't consider the anything that looks like this script to be Hebrew to them. They consider it to be Yiddish. The other issue is that, and if you look at all the list of the Dead Sea Scrolls, you won't find a section of Deuteronomy 28 in it. I actually looked at a Hebrew Israelite who was describing this and was trying to comment on the videos I made, but he never showed a Dead Sea Scroll, and the reason is because for when it comes to Deuteronomy 28:68, the Dead Sea Scrolls, that particular section wasn't found in anything that they've had found so far. The other issue is that the Dead Sea Scrolls, while useful from an intellectual perspective and a research perspective, they're not considered authoritative to Torah Moshe Jews. Essentially because they were written by people who were kind of separating themselves out, even if they were writing some of the same text. Their texts are not authoritative, essentially. And that covers it from the Torah Moshe Jewish side. So one of the things I did, because again, I had once asked a Hebrew Israelite to kind of show me an ancient Hebrew Israelite text that of what their text says, not because I needed it, but just simply because I was trying to show them that Torah Moshe Jews and Hebrew Israelites don't share a common text, and we don't share a common language or a common culture. We may have similarities, but we're not the same people, and that's something that Hebrew Israelites even tell me all the time. And but then I say that, and then all of a sudden there's some Hebrew Israelites that go back and say, no, 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 we have the same text. I'm like, wait a minute, you just said a second ago we don't have the same text. And basically what I had to do was I looked up and said, okay, what text do Hebrew Israelites consider to be authoritative? And here are a few of them that I found that are authoritative. Now, Torah Moshe Jews don't use these kind of texts. These texts would not be acceptable in my community. In the city I live in, they're not acceptable amongst Torah Moshe Jews. Now, they may be perfectly fine for Hebrew Israelites, but they're not acceptable in my community, for example. Just like my texts are not acceptable in Hebrew Israelite communities. So, looking at this a little bit further, and again, let's go by what the Hebrew Israelite commenters say, because one of the things I want to do is reconstruct what their text probably looks like in their ancient language, as best as possible. So, for example, this Hebrew Israelite who's commented on some of my videos several times says, "So, what type of oses you spewing? So, if dog practice Torah, that make him Jewish." And she specifically says the Bantus are not Jewish; we are Israelites. And she says, we all have the same DNA and are not mixed. We are all still Africas. And just because you study Hebrew don't mean you are. We are a specific family with the same genetic makeup. So what you're saying is complete foolishness. Okay. So the next Hebrew Israelite from about 9 years ago says, hey, you should do your own research, but type in most ancient Hebrew biblical inscription deciphered scholar says. This is not Moses Hebrew, but it lets you see how much Hebrew has changed. Dead Sea Scrolls are not in Yiddish. Okay, so he says that what I'm using is Yiddish in one from the other. And he says that the Dead Sea Scrolls, I guess, are his proof text for what he's going by. So he also mentioned another point where he says that Hebrew Ivrit about this sound and Hebrew pronunciation is a Semitic language, blah, blah, blah. He says culturally is considered by Jews and other religious groups as the language of the Jewish people. He says so the Jews speaking originally was as real as Santa. They only claim they speak biblical Hebrew the same as their claim to be from the tribe of Judah, a black nation. So he says that Jews are not speaking the language that his people he claimed to speak. He also seems to be saying that Jews and him are and his people are not genetically or even culture related to each other. So okay. Another one that we saw earlier, Tasu Foli, says, you Ashkenazi are sons of Gomer. So I guess he's calling me Ashkenazi too. He says that is nothing more. Kikongo is Hebrew, not Yiddish. Okay, so he says that in his culture, Kikonga is Hebrew and not Yiddish. Got it. So another one called Moors Are Israelites says, man, what are you talking about? We read the same Ten Commandments in Hebrew just as you or others that live in Canaan, Israel today. I'll show a Paleo-Hebrew sheet of the Ten Commandments in an upcoming vid. Cool down, Now, he seems to contradict the previous guys, the previous people who commented. So again, he says he's a Moor. Maybe there's a difference between Moor Israelites and other Hebrew Israelites. I don't know. That's up to Hebrew Israelites to decide. But he says he reads the same text. But we'll see later that he said something else that makes it different, which means he's not reading the same text. And again, I'm not, he says he's reading Paleo Hebrew. In my community, we don't use Paleo Hebrew. Okay, so then another guy named Jeff Gray says, Fasol Kasora, Ghana, Togo, Benin. He's, I guess, commenting on someone else. Ghana, Togo, Benin, Nigeria are called Ereve, Niyikba, Hebrew land, the Hamai, tribe of Dan. Again, those Jews in Israel now aren't the real biblical people, period. By the way, Jerusalem is in northeast Africa. Okay, so remember that. This is what he's saying. So he's also saying that there's no connection between Torah Moshe Jews and Hebrew Israelites, and he says that Jerusalem is in northeast Africa. Okay, so if we go a little bit further, there was another Hebrew Israelite who commented on an interview that was done with me by a group called the Dagger Squad. They contacted me and wanted to interview me and ask some questions, and I gave them answers based upon my experience. And if you listen to the interview, again, I'm not bashing the Hebrew Israelites. I'm just answering some questions, and then because I'm not a Hebrew Israelite, my family aren't. Just giving straightforward answers. But she says that she says I am so happy to understand the true meaning of Deuteronomy 28:68. Okay, it's very telling the way she worded it. This Jewish brother, talking about me, is so lost in his understanding. Mori Zion lacks slave his brother's lack of knowledge. Brainwashing is some kind of drug, brothers. Okay, so again, she seems to say that her community has a different understanding. And I even looked up her profile. She had like a lot of Christian stuff on there, which also basically makes it out that again, Hebrew Israelites. I know some of them are Christian, some of them aren't, and I'm not very clear on which, but it doesn't even matter. It's not important for me to know. But basically, she has a particular point of view. And then also going back to this Moor Israelite guy, he says, when I asked him some questions about their ancient texts, he says, yes, the Los Lunos Ten Commandment Stone was written by the 10 tribes from the Northern Kingdom when they arrived in the Americas between 722 and 721 BC. And he quotes Edris 2 for this. He says, yes, we have Tanakh just as you. Some of us even have Torah scrolls. The stone was written by ancient Israelites from the 10 tribes that came to America after the Assyrian captivity, not us, Judah, Benjamin, blah, blah, blah. This is the so-called Cherokee, Chickasaw, Apache are descendants of the Gaddis that made the Lost Stone Stone. Okay, so that's a Hebrew Israelite claim. It may be a Moorish one. In Torah Moshe Jews, we don't have any stake in any of that. That's a Hebrew Israelite claim and a Hebrew Israelite claim. So let's look at what he said here. He says the Los Lunas Stone was written by, I guess, Hebrew Israelites, from what they call their Northern Kingdom. Let's take a look at this stone. So the things is this stone is not authoritative to a Torah Moshe Jew. If you read it, if you really read it, because I did actually try to like understand how it's written, and it's actually has like a lot of different like spellings and wordings that are not like ones found in Torah Moshe Jewish text. This is purely, if you will, I guess going by what he says, is completely a Hebrew Israelite text. So finally, we found a methodology to understand what a Hebrew Israelite text looks like. So that being said, one of the things I wanted to do was first of all take this Hebrew Israelite claim and try to use it to reconstruct what their text says. Now notice how this particular graphics I found on Hebrew Israelite sites say the following. One of them says, "And the Lord will bring you back into Egypt again with ships. By the way, whereof I spake unto thee, thou shalt see it no more again, and there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondsmen and bondswomen, and no man shall buy you." So interesting enough, their text keeps in this "no man shall buy you," at least in English, whoever translated this, which is interesting that it's in like kind of middle Old English or something. But also it says here that "and ye shall be sold into your enemies." So that means that their text is obviously different when it comes to the statement of "you will sell yourselves." It means they're using a different text. And then he quotes like Revelations, which is like a Christian text. So again, that's another difference. If Hebrew Israelites are Christians, which again, it's not up for me to decide, but this is from the Hebrew Israelite side. So, so one of the things I tried to do, again, just taking all the comments that I've got from Hebrew Israelites over the years, I tried to reconstruct what their text in their form of Hebrew must look like based upon what they were saying. So basically what I came up with was the following, using a script that I think is acceptable to them, that meets the standards that they seem to have put in place, that is not Yiddish, of course. And if you're a Hebrew Israelite watching this, you're going to have to excuse my pronunciation because, again, I'm not a Hebrew Israelite and I don't really know how you guys pronounce it, but that's perfectly fine. It's your culture. I'm just trying to represent textually what I think you guys have. So basically, if you go by it, the first line would be, Shivacho lemitzrayim kodim. Okay, kodim, basically meaning that you'll be returned to Mitzrayim first. Then it would have to probably be something like V'acharchach od pam tegolu aval ve'ani aviacho. So meaning that afterwards, another time, you'd be like basically exiled. Um, but I, meaning whoever's doing the exiling, will bring you aviacho. Next line being le'eretz me'ever midbar hagadol b'derech b'marav, meaning that to a land across the big desert, in the west, like b'derech marav in the west. And then continuing, Vasham, Nimkartem, Le'am Lebanim, Me'ever Yam Gadol. So I should probably put a hey there, Yam Gadol. So basically that translated would mean in there, you'll be sold to like almost like a group of a people that are white across the Great Sea. And then lastly, the the last line, it says, it would basically say, Ba'aniyot la'avodim u'leshibchot behem yiknu etchem. So this is the best attempt I could come up with, and let's go and break this down a little bit further in terms of what exactly it would mean in terms of the differences between this reconstruction I made of the Hebrew Israelite text based on their claims and our Torah Moshe Jewish text, which is completely different. Okay, so going by the first section here. What you see is that basically in the red, it would be, I would have to add the word kodim, meaning that when it says that you'll be brought back to Egypt, it would have to have first in it, meaning that first to be a first stop in Egypt. So it had to denote something that says that they would go there first. And then in the blue, what it basically describes is how they were taken from Egypt to West Africa. This is the way that I would see that a Hebrew Israelite text would say it in order to 100% make it clear over what's happening so that there's no dispute over who we're even talking about here. And it helps out the Hebrew Israelite claim if this was actually in their text. The next thing would be that the Hebrew Israelite text would have, continuing on, that in the red, nim karotem, the use of the word nim karotem, which means you will be sold, and it definitely means you'll be sold. So there's no debate about this. That nim karotem means you'll be sold. So personally, we can try to debate about what hit karotem means, but Jewish texts and sources we agree on what it says. What Torah Moshe does, but Hebrew Israelites, in their text that I've reconstructed, they would have to say banim karotem, which definitely means you'll be sold. So it's very clear. Further in the blue, it makes it clear that the place where they'll be sold is across the big ocean in a distant land where there'll be white people who will sell them, basically. So again, if they had that in their text, it make it clear. And then the green makes it clear that in the place the Hebrew Israelites will definitely be bought. So we took out, the Jewish text would have to be different because the Jewish text has va'en koneh, but the Hebrew Israelite text that I've reconstructed says that they will be bought. So it makes it clear that the people will be bought. So I think with this particular text, I think this best mirrors what the Hebrew Israelite text is and what the claims are around it. So I think my reconstruction meets all the criteria I'm placed upon, from the different Hebrew Israelites who commented on videos. Now, one of the problems that does exist with this particular claim is that the Hebrew Israelites are not the only African American group that has a competing narrative for what Black Americans are historically and what was happening before the enslavement of West African people. Of course, the Nation of Islam, for example, claims that African Americans are like Islamic Asiatics, or originally. And that's basically what their claim is, which is a competing claim with the Hebrew Israelite claim. The Moore Science Temple has another claim which competes with both claims. I'm not 100% certain on it, but what it is exactly. But I've heard of them and I know of them, and I know it's not the same as the Hebrew Israelite claim, maybe with the exception of some of the Moorish type of Hebrew Israelites. And then also you have the conscious movement, or a particular form of conscious movement that says that African Americans are Egyptian in some form or format. So these are competing claims, and there have been a number of videos I've seen from America where there have been debates between these various groups and Hebrew Israelites about what the narrative is of African American history. So again, it's not my place to be involved in it. It's just something that people have to be aware of when they, get into these debates, because again, it's not me making this up, and I have no stake in the debate. Whatever group has the most realistic information and historical information is who people should go by, as far as I'm concerned. So then again, the question is, well, what is the middle ground? And we covered this earlier, but I just want to cover it all over again. What we came to earlier was the conclusion that Hebrew Israelites have their own distinct titles, text, concepts, languages, needs, actions, claims, and nationalities. We also claimed that Torah Messiah Jews have our own distinct titles, text, concepts, languages, needs, actions, claims, nationalities. Basically, we're talking about two different groups of people here who don't share like common information in a lot of areas. But that's okay. There's no reason that either group has to be in argument with each other. We can both be on two different sides of a river and be in our respective places that we respect and that are working out for us. And that's the way I look at it. And that's, I think, answers all sides of this issue. So essentially, I think when we come to the conclusion that textually wise, we see that there, is problem solved. There's no connection between Jewish text by Torah Moshe Jews, specifically Torah Moshe Jews, and Hebrew Israelites. We have different texts and we have different understandings of those texts. And again, if Hebrew Israelites have an understanding that they've received from their commentators from the last 2,000 years, I searched for some. I couldn't find any Hebrew Israelite commentators from about, prior to like 200 years ago, 300 years ago, 400 years ago, 1,000 years ago. So I can only go by what the people who are Hebrew Israelites who comment on my videos and write things say. So taking what they've said, I think we've pretty much resolved the issue, that there's no conflict. So this is Ehav from the Chronicles of Ehav, and I hope that answers it. Take care. Bye.